Welcome to Sewing Face Masks with the Creation Station. I'm Ronni, the main sewing instructor here at the Creation Station, and today I'm going to be walking you through how to sew two different types of basic face masks, the fitted mask and the surgical style mask. In this video, I'm going to be using the heavy-duty Singer machines we have here at the Creation Station. If you want to follow along with your own machine, the steps will be pretty much the same. Just account for any differences in how your machine runs. We made another face mask sewing video way back in March, but the production quality of that video was pretty low, so I wanted to produce something a bit more high quality. Hopefully this will be much easier to follow. The fitted face mask follows the same pattern I used back then. I'll link to where you can find this pattern template in the description below. I'm also adding in the surgical style mask. I prefer the fitted design myself, but the surgical mask is much easier to sew and much quicker to sew. To start on the fitted mask, I need to cut out my pattern pieces. My mask is going to be double layered so I can include a filter pocket, and since I'm using a pattern fabric, I need to make sure to flip one piece over so I can trace the pattern in a different direction. I'm cutting these out of a regular, non-stretch cotton fabric. Quilting cotton is some of the best material you can use to make face masks from. You may be tempted to use a stretchy fabric for your mask, especially if you're following a no-sew tutorial, because surely stretchy material is more forgiving and easier to fit on your face, right? But unfortunately, stretch fabric is actually pretty dangerous when it comes to face masks, because the threads of the fabric are actually separating from each other as the material stretches. That means it's creating gaps that are wide enough for droplets to pass through, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid by wearing a mask in the first place. Plus, if you've never machine sewn on stretchy fabric, it's actually quite difficult to work with. With cotton and many non-stretch fabrics, the gaps between the threads are plenty wide for air to pass through, but tight enough to catch the droplets and particles in the air. You can actually run a test on your fabric to see how good it is. Hold a bit of the fabric you want to use up to a bright light, like a window, and look through it. If you can easily see through the fabric, it's too loosely woven. You need to use something a bit heavier and denser. You should be able to see light coming through the fabric, but not clear images. Of course, any mask is better than no mask. Now that I have 4 pieces, I'm going to sew them into 2 pairs with the right sides together along this curve. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, so if you use a larger seam allowance, your mask will be a bit smaller. Keep that in mind when you cut out your fabric. To flatten this seam out, I'm going to iron it down to one side. This is pretty tricky to do with a curved seam, but it can be much easier if you clip the fabric a little bit. I'm also going to be doing a top stitch to hold this seam down. This isn't strictly necessary, so you can skip this if you find it's way too difficult. The side with the pattern fabric is going to be on my outside, which means on this other fabric I need to fold these 2 sides down to form my filter pocket. I'm not measuring, and my mask comes out to be pretty asymmetrical because of it, so I'd recommend measuring about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in and ironing the fold there. Now, with right sides together, I'm going to clip the 2 halves of this mask together, matching seams as best as possible. I'm using clips instead of pins for a couple of reasons. 1, clips don't accidentally poke me, which is good. But 2, pins will poke small holes into your fabric, and we're trying to avoid having holes in our fabric as much as possible. To assemble these 2 sides, just sew along the top and bottom edges, right off the edge of the inner fabric. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of each seam. Next, I'm going to flip my mask right side out, and then iron it down so it finally starts to look like a proper mask. I could do another top stitch along the top and bottom edges here, and I could also add in a little channel for a nose wire, but those are both aesthetic choices that I'm going to skip for now. If you want to see how those work, you can skip to 18 minutes in on the original video, which I'll link to below. To finish off this mask, I just need to make a channel for the elastic, which I do by folding in the end of the outer fabric so it meets the pocket fabric without overlapping it. When I sew this down, I'm going to ignore seam allowance and just sew along the inner edge to give the channel as much room as possible for the elastic. Then just add the elastic and it's done. I like my elastic band to wrap around my whole head so there's less strain on my ears, but you can cut your elastic however you want it. Now onto the surgical style mask. This pattern is much easier because all you need is a rectangle of fabric, and there's no sewing or ironing along a curve. For this one, I'm using a 13 by 9.5 inch rectangle. That makes a mask that's about 6 inches down and 9 inches across. You might find that you need yours to be bigger or smaller. Measure your face and see what feels right for you. I'm still using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I'm adding a 1/2 inch to each of my measurements. Once this is cut out, I fold it in half right sides inside and sew along the top, leaving a gap in the center about 2 inches. It doesn't have to be exact, just enough to pull the fabric through. Now I need to place my elastic. This is actually a bit tricky because the elastic needs to go inside of the mask. That way, when I flip it right side out, the elastic is on the outside. For this one, I want the elastic to go around my ears, so I'm going to cut a length that feels right. It's always better to have too much than too little, and place each end of the elastic about 1/2 inch from the top and bottom of the mask. These get carefully clipped into place in an arc, like so. If I wanted this elastic to go around my head, I would clip the elastic down across like this. If you find this is too difficult to do, you can always add the elastic after you flipped the fabric right side out. It doesn't look as clean, but it's much easier to sew. Either way, I'm going to sew up the 2 sides now. Next, I flip my elastic through the little opening I left for myself, being careful to be gentle so the fabric doesn't rip the seams. To get these corners crisp and sharp, I use a chopstick or a dull pencil. This is starting to look like a real mask already, but it's too big to fit my face comfortably as is, so I'm going to pleat the sides. To make a pleat, just fold the fabric over itself and sew it down. I want my mask to be a little less than 3 inches on each side. You can measure this, but I'm just going to fold my fabric over until I get 2 pleats that look pretty good. Make sure to fold the mask evenly the whole way across, and it's much easier if you iron it down at this point. The final step with this mask is to sew down those pleats, plus the gap I left in the mask way back in step 1. If you want to make a surgical mask with a filter pocket, you can actually leave that gap in, but I'm going to top stitch over it for this mask. I can do that all in one seam if I turn my fabric 90 degrees at each corner. And that's it! My surgical mask is done. The mask took about half as much time, partly because I didn't have to iron so much. And both of these masks are machine washable, which means I can throw one in the laundry at the end of each day and have a fresh, clean mask ready to go. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you have any comments or questions and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. For next month's sewing face masks with the Creation Station, I'll be looking into how to design and make face masks for costumes and cosplay, which I'm especially excited for with Halloween coming up. It'll be a fun video and I can't wait to see you then!